Good afternoon, everyone. This is Leslie Seidel at the Institute for Research on Public Policy in Montreal. I'm the research director for the program on Canada's Changing Federal Community, and it's part of the program that we are holding this webinar on one of our recent research studies. We are doing this in partnership with the Canadian Association for Business Economics, which is a professional development organization dedicated to advancing the understanding of applied economics in the public and private sectors on a wide range of business, investment, economic, and public policy issues. Paul Jacobson, its past president, initiated this partnership. He approached us on the very day that the publication came out and asked if we would be interested in doing a webinar, and we said yes. He and Armin Yalnizyan, who is the current president of CABE, are pleased that IRPP agreed to share Professor Montpetit's research with their members and subscribers. As I mentioned, this is part of the research program on Canada's Changing Federal Community. In this program, we're addressing some of the questions that you would normally associate with that topic, such as intergovernmental transfers and processes and federal institutions. But we're also looking at two areas that might not necessarily decode from that title. We are commissioning research and have already published on certain Indigenous issues, particularly those related to governance. And we're also looking at some of the more theoretical or identity-related issues that are part of what is sometimes called a federal society. We are, as many federations are, a diverse country, and the institutions and processes of federalism play a role, sometimes not perfect, but nevertheless play a role in bridging these diversities. At the same time, so do senses of identity, and shared values. And that's really what we're looking at today. The research study that Professor Montpetit did with Éric Lachapelle, who's also at the University of Montreal, and Simon Kiss, who is at Wilfrid Laurier University. They presented an earlier version of this study at the American Political Science Association a little bit over a year ago, and asked us if we were interested in publishing it in our program. We, of course, said yes to their offer. So I'll introduce Éric Montpetit. Before I do that, though, if while he's making his presentation, you want to send us a question, just type it in the chat box on the bottom of your screen. Professor Montpetit is at the University of Montreal. He's a full professor there and also Vice Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences for faculty life. He has published extensively on policymaking in the Canadian federal context, as well as on the politics of scientific expertise. So over to you, Eric, and we look forward to your presentation.
Also to thank the Canadian Association for Business Economics, as well, of course, as the IRPP for organizing the webinar, but also for publishing the study that Leslie mentioned earlier. This is my first webinar, and although I know that several people are watching, it kind of feels strange to speak to my computer, but I'll try to be as engaging as possible. I guess that the first slide is on now, the one showing the study that I've conducted with my colleagues Éric Lachapelle and Simon Kiss. This is a study. I'll begin by giving you a bit of background on this study. Of course, we all know that Canada is one of the most decentralized federation in the world. It's common for people in Canada, especially, to complain about the lack of cohesion that this decentralization might engender, complain about provinces and regions that have distinct interests, therefore, as well as distinct cultures, and therefore a high propensity perhaps to have conflict with each other. And of course, the result of all this is a difficulty or a difficult context for the making of national policy decisions, but also provincial policy decisions. And there are some current examples of this, of that type of complaint or worries that exist related to the decentralized character of Canadian federalism. Of course, probably the most current example is the pipeline issues that have been debated in Canada. One decision pitting British Columbia and Alberta. Another more recent decision made by a private company pitting Quebec against Alberta, and talking about Energy East here. So this is the type of context that basically brought us to conduct that study. There's also an interesting provincial example. The Quebec government recently introduced Bill 62 to restrict religious symbols in some public services, and of course that has to a large extent pitted Quebec against English Canada, at least in the media. As we'll see, the reality of public opinion is way more complex than what the media has suggested. Now let's move to the next slide, which gives you in one sentence the argument of the paper, the main argument that we're making and that I'll be presenting here today. Basically, the argument is that the fears of interregional disagreements are widely exaggerated. That is, we found very little evidence that there might be interregional conflicts that are deep and harmful for policymaking at the national level, especially, or at the provincial level, as the example that I just gave might illustrate. Now, let me give you the basic reasoning, turning to the next slide, behind this argument. Now you'll have to cope with me here. It's a bit theoretical, but you have to understand where we come from to understand the main argument that we're making. Now, in any democracy, what you'll have is a range of values. People have different values. There's always a plurality of values. And these values, they matter. We know that from years, actually, of political science studies. We know that these values, they matter a great deal for the formation of policy preferences. That is, some do. We know also that some don't, but some do. And one of the things that we try to understand is why some values will translate into policy preferences, and while other values that are there will not. And one of the answer is the framing process. And, you know, to make a long story short, a framing process refers to the way that we talk about issues. And here we're interested in this study in public opinion, and therefore, like, the role of the media is particularly important. And it's basically the media that speak about or address policy issues in one way or another. And in doing so, what they'll do is activate some values and not others. And as a result of this, basically what you have is a range of policy preferences that is usually a bit narrower than the range of values themselves. That is, again, the framing process will not activate every single value. It will activate just some of them. And as a result, what you'll have is a narrower range of policy preferences, and therefore a debate that is not perhaps as vicious or as polarized as one might expect if you only look at value. So framing processes are extremely important. And let me give you like a very, very simple example here. You might all know that in Quebec, the debate over the development of the shale gas industry was quite important. It was a salient issue for a while on the public agenda here. And the way that the media talked about this issue was, and I'm simplifying the story here just to make it clear, but basically what the media said about this was that this issue was about a wealthy industry basically invading local properties in some areas of Quebec, the local population, and in doing so causing important environmental damages for profit that they won't share with the local population. And so you will understand that if an issue is presented in this way, it will activate values of social justice, but perhaps not other values. And it's basically what has happened here in Quebec. And as a result of this, what you had was a lot of people basically having these or being preoccupied by social justice, being really, really against shale gas development, and people not necessarily having or not having this value, but having other sets of values, not really caring about this issue, not feeling concerned by it, simply because, again, the way the issue was framed was not activating their own particular values. So that's in the basis of our reasoning. Now, what's the effect of federalism in this? Please show the next slide. Basically, the effect of federalism in this process is to fragment the framing process. What you'll have is as many framing processes as you have federated units in your federation. In Canada, there are 10 provinces, and so you'll have at least 10 framing processes. Some people think that in some regions are more cohesive, and we actually show that in our own study. I'll come back to that later. But what you might have is different framing processes that are common to a region, but no single national framing process. So process is very fragmented, and that is to say nothing of the possibility that the range of values itself in a federation might be wider, because some regions have values that are not present in other regions, and those regions feature values that are not present in the first region. So basically, you might also have a wider range of values and federations than you would have in a unitary country, for instance. Let me just basically clear this possibility out of the way. We found no evidence that federalism increase the range of values in Canada whatsoever. But we do find some evidence that actually federalism does, to an extent, fragments the framing process, and it's quite important. Let me come back to this example of natural gas development. Of course, it's possible to speak about it in a way that will appeal to the values of social justice, but it's also possible to speak about the issue in a different way. Speak about it in terms of wealth creation, for example, and this will activate an entirely different set of values. And therefore, if in a federation, because the process is fragmented and you have like different framings in different regions, at the very end, if you look at the issue from the national level, what you'll have is a wider range of policy preferences that stem from social justice, but also preferences that will stem from values more associated with the wealth creation, for example. And so that's how federalism would amplify policy disagreement. It would basically curtail the framing process in narrowing down the range of policy preferences. It would multiply the framing processes, and therefore multiply the range of policy preferences as well. And that's what you see on the slide here. Now, moving on to the next slide, what I want to show here is how we can visualize the effect of federalism. If you take the graph on the left, for example, what you have is here an example of federalism not having any effect, basically, on policy disagreement. Take this example again of shale gas development. When presented or when framed as an issue that appealed to proponents of social justice, basically it does increase their opposition. Well, actually, that would not be a good example here, because what we see here is social justice increasing support. But I mean, you can use any single issue to visualize the effect. Here, basically, the frame doesn't make a difference on proponent of social justice, whether they live in region A or region B. The graph on the right is an example of how federalism would amplify policy disagreement. Here in region B, social justice would stimulate support among proponents a little bit, not much, but a little bit. Whereas it would have the opposite effect, like the framing of the issue would have the opposite effect in region A. And of course, here what you have is greater distance among the proponent of social justice on the graph on the right side, as opposed to the graph on the left side, where again, proponents of social justice in region A or in region B have very similar policy preferences. So that's how we visualize the effect of federalism and of framing processes on policy policy debates, and how it amplifies policy debates. Now, how real is the effect of federalism on policy disagreement? Now let's move to the next slide. What we did to answer the question basically is a large survey of Canadians. We surveyed 5,000 Canadians in the spring of 2015. We have representative samples in 5 regions, that is BC, the Prairies, Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic. It would have been ideal, of course, to have representative samples in all 10 provinces, but it would also have been quite costly, so we settled for 5 regions. And we've shown, once the analysis was done, that it would not have added that much value had we had representative samples in every single province. I mean, we of course have respondents in every single province, and when we looked at their difference in attitude within a region, it's not all that different from the rest of the region. In the Atlantic, for instance, if we look at people in Nova Scotia, their attitude is not all that different from those in New Brunswick. And it's the same thing for the Prairies. So we decided to, again, just focus on these 5 regions, knowing that 3 of them still are provinces. We included a lot of questions in that survey. Of course, value questions, they are extremely important here. We drew these questions at the outset from the literature. There's a vast literature in political science on values, and it's an empirical literature. So we had like several examples of value questions. Most of these value questions were used in the American context, and so we thought that to validate these questions and perhaps adjust them, we had to run some focus groups. We did a focus group in Montreal, actually 2 in Montreal and 2 in Toronto, and that led to some minor adjustments in the value questions, but still we kind of remain rather close to the mainstream literature on values at the end. We also included questions on spending priorities that we thought were very important at the time: social welfare, the environment, defense, the CBC, education, and science. These are issues that are quite important and perhaps controversial, at least some of them, during the budgeting process in Ottawa. So that's why we included them. We also had 12 issue-specific questions. Like you have the list of the issues here. I'll be presenting later on just a few of them, but know that we had way more than what I'll be presenting. And for those who care about the quality of statistical analysis, we also had lots of questions that we used as socio-demographic controls. Of course, there's not only values that do impact on policy disagreement. Revenues, for instance, might have an impact. Age, gender. So they're all factors that could impact on disagreement, and know that all the analysis that I'll be presenting in a minute include controls for these factors. Now, let me move on to the next slide, which presents the result of our analysis on values in Canada. Again, we had 18 questions on values. We reduced these questions to 3 sets of questions that are cohesive, at least we thought. And we also thought that these 3 sets of questions were resonating with 3 broad values, if you like. One that we call egalitarianism, which basically is social justice, people who value more equality in society. The second one is traditionalism. It's the traditional. It's those people basically who measure high on this value. It's people who basically value a traditional organization of society, and you have the questions here that we use to measure that. And we had like a third value that that we thought was important. We called it legal rigorism, for a lack of a better term. Basically, it's people who value the rule of law for everyone and who defer to authority, who value respect for the authorities. Of course, it doesn't mean that other values don't exist and don't matter, but our set of questions, which was quite wide again, does allow us to capture these 3 values and excluded also, it allowed us to exclude a number of values. We had some questions, for instance, aimed at measuring individualism, and we found these questions not to add anything to our analysis. Well, they were not loading together in the factor analysis and were not clearly associated with distinctive policy preferences. So clearly, the values that we believe matter most in Canada are the 3 values that are presented on these slides. Now, let me show you the distribution of values by regions on the next slide. I won't speak long about this graph. It just shows something that might be counterintuitive to some people, and that is that the 3 sets of values that I just presented are significant, are important in all 5 regions. So it's not as if traditionalism was the value of one region and social justice or equalitarianism the value of another region. These 3 sets of values are present in every single region. There are like some differences in terms of distribution, but they are rather small differences. Again, each of these values have a significant presence in each of the regions, and that in itself is an important finding. Again, some people believe that there are lots of inter-regional or inter-provincial conflicts because province and regions have different cultures. Well, if cultures is equal to values, that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems that we have way more in common than this thesis would suggest. Now, moving on to the first slide that shows the effect of values on preferences, and in this case, it shows the effect of values on the preference for CBC spending. At the time, there was quite a bit of a debate on this. It was, I guess, an issue perhaps a bit more controversial in English Canada. The Conservatives were in power. In Quebec, I mean, you'd have reason to believe that that the CBC is particular, that Radio-Canada is particularly important, perhaps more than the CBC is in English Canada. And so we thought this was an important question. And now we use the result of this to show that, in fact, there's no evidence that federalism has had a huge impact on this issue. In fact, what we find is values having very, very similar effect from one region to the next. That is, if you are an egalitarian, you're more likely to be in favor of more spending on the CBC. If you are a legal rigorist, you're more likely to be against more spending on the CBC, and that is independent of regions. That is, this is true. These patterns are true in every single Canadian region. Therefore, we don't see here on this graph, on this slide, any evidence that federalism would amplify policy disagreements. Now, moving to the next slide, defense spending. I decided to show you this slide simply because here there is some evidence that federalism might have a small effect on disagreement. If you look at the first graph on the left, what you see is what you see is egalitarianism having like a very modest effect on preferences for less defense spending, if you like, except in one region, and it's the Atlantic provinces. And there might be different reasons for this. It might be the case that in the Atlantic, defense spending, since there are lots of military base, defense spending is framed as an issue that involves like, the creation of jobs for families and so on and so forth, and therefore it might be the reason why there is like a small increase in favor of more military spending among egalitarian in the Atlantic. But again, the effect is very small and not really statistically significant, I have to say. So it's a very, very weak evidence that federalism would matter. The value that is most clearly activated by debates over defense spending in Canada is legal rigorism. It does increase support for military spending quite significantly, and it does so across Canada in every single region. So again, we have like small evidence here that federalism might matter, but the evidence is rather weak. Now moving on to the next slide, the gun registry. Another issue. Now we're moving to the specific policy issues here, moving away from the spending priorities. So specific issues. We asked people the extent to which they were in support of maintaining a gun registry, and we were expecting perhaps Albertans to have or people from the prairies to have a different attitude towards this than the rest of Canadians, and especially Quebecers, where all this started. Remember, like the shooting at La Polytechnique several years ago. Well, in fact, we don't really find that, and we find that it's values that matter way more than regions here. Basically, the value that is most clearly activated here is social justice. So it's basically proponents of more equality that are most in favor of maintaining a gun registry. Those who value the traditional organization of society are perhaps a bit less in favor, but I mean the difference between these people and those who don't value a traditional order of society is very different. And here legal rigorism is not having any effect at all. Now, next slide, religious symbols. Again, we were expecting Quebec to be different on this. Like if you read the media, if you've read the media in the past few weeks, you've seen English Canadians complaining about Quebec having perhaps a different attitude towards this than the rest of Canada. Well, this shows that it's not really the case. If there is like a region that stands out, it's more the Atlantic than Quebec. And you find the strongest support for restricting visible religious symbols, in three regions among legal rigorists. And those regions are the Prairies, BC, and Ontario, not Quebec. So that's quite significant. But then again, I mean, what you have here is very, very weak evidence that federalism amplifies policy debate. Mostly the value the value that is most clearly activated again here is legal rigorism, and it's activated largely in the same way from region to region. Now, moving to the last issue that I want to show you, again, one that is that has been quite salient lately, is the pipeline issue. Like we asked a question on support for Energy East in the 2015 survey, and again, we were expecting perhaps a different attitude in the prairies as opposed to the other regions where the pipeline was to go through, and we do not find much evidence of very distinctive attitude from province to province. The two values that are most clearly activated here are equalitarianism and legal rigorism. Equalitarianism reduces support while legal rigorism increases it, and it does so in every single Canadian region. Now, I want to conclude this with some implications for policy making. So we can now move to the last slide. We drew from the paper three main implications for policy making. The first is that policy should be designed, framed, and promoted primarily to appeal to values and not to regions. Basically, when policymakers and policy advocates as well try to appeal to a region, what they do is create an artificial dimension to the debate, one that is not necessary and one that is not likely to generate national support. Again, we have to keep in mind that every single of the three values that we've looked at here have a significant presence in every single region. And therefore, if you appeal to one or two of these values in your discourse, you are most likely to get support from one ocean to the next. You don't need to appeal to a particular region, which is likely to pit you against the other region. If you appeal to one of these three values, or to more than one of these two values, because of course you can appeal your discourse, the way you talk about the issue can activate several values going in the same direction. Legal rigorism and traditionalism, for instance, or even legal rigorism as well as egalitarianism. That's the best guarantee you'll have to basically get national support. Second implication, regional appeals should be limited to activating values that are often overlooked by policymakers and advocates in some regions. We intuitively associate some regions with a specific value. We shouldn't do that. It's not necessary to speak as a social democrat to speak to Quebecers, because traditionalism and legal rigorism is also present in Quebec. And you don't need to speak as a conservative to appeal to Albertans, because social democratic values, or I should say egalitarianism, as well as legal rigorism, is also present in Alberta. And therefore, every single region is a pluralist entity, and what you need to do is to, if you want to appeal to a region, is to appeal to values that have been largely overlooked in the past, simply because people were assuming that these values were not present in these regions. Last implication, provincial policymakers and advocates have much to learn from one another. What our analysis shows is that basically policymakers all across Canada deal with very similar policy debates, and therefore they can help each other probably way more than they assume, if they assume, of course, that their region is very specific. Thank you.
Eric, for that very good presentation of your study. I would imagine that those online would agree with me that this is important political science, but it's also important for our understanding of the differences within Canada, and it really calls into question some of the stereotypes, as Eric pointed out at the tail end. So we'll now turn to questions and comments that you can type in on the below your screen. We have a question, a good one already. This one will challenge you, Eric, I think, a little bit. Could your model be conceivably applied to policy disagreements between Indigenous and settler governments? Does the different institutional frame affect this?
It's a very good question, in fact, and all I can do here is speculate, because of course I have not surveyed Aboriginal populations. It might very well be the case that they do have specific values, and that you know, they might not also, and that their values, even if they're the same as us, might not be activated by the same type of discourse as those who are not Aboriginal people. I mean, what could be done if one was interested in this study is, first of all, try to get, and from my understanding, it's a bit of a challenge, but one should try to get representative samples of the Aboriginal population, and then try, as we did, to find which values or how values organize themselves within this population, and then compare with the rest of the Canadian population and see whether or not, again, they have the same values, whether they're activated in the same ways, and whether they lead to similar policy preferences. But again, like, I don't have an answer. I cannot argue that the presence of Aboriginal in Canada would amplify policy disagreement or not, because I don't have any empirical data to make that claim. But
thank you. Sorry, Eric, I'm going to put another question. Rather than be unfair to the person who sent it and try to summarize it, I'm going to read it. It's a little bit long, so heads up. Are the value differences that count between the provinces not in the average voter, but more the marginal voter that provincial governments chase to win in a plurality voting system? Does this not explain the differences in policies pursued by provinces despite the relative homogeneity of values across the Federation? I agree that every region is a plurality, but presumably elected policymakers are thinking strategically in the highest profile issues because they might affect electoral support.
Very good point. And in fact, I mean, as I've mentioned, there are differences in the distribution of these values from one region to the next. I mean, it's clear that there are more egalitarian in Quebec than in the prairies, and that there are more traditionalists in the prairies than in Quebec. I mean, that is clear. But the difference is not as large as one might expect, and especially these provinces are not homogeneous, and that's the main message, I guess, that we wanted to run across. Now, when it comes to electoral politics, of course, province will try, if there's more conservative in Alberta, well, perhaps governments will try to appeal to these values more than to social democratic values. Although the fact that we found 3 sets of distinct values that can be associated in various ways make the electoral outcome quite unpredictable to a large extent. That is, I mean, it might very well be that in a particular election there is an association, or that equalitarian and legal rigorists are brought together to vote for a single party. That might certainly occur, and in a different election, it might be the conservative or the traditionalist and the legal rigorists that basically coalesce to support a given party. So yeah, but I mean, there's no question that that governments, in every region will have a tendency to adopt different policies, and I mean, we don't dispute that. And there are several reasons for this. Public opinion might push to an extent toward policies that are perhaps a bit closer than we would expect, but not always. And again, like the play of the 3 sets of values that we've identified might explain some of the differences.
Okay, the questions are coming in at a good pace now. I'm going to read another one. It's fairer for the person who sent it in. Could a similar argument that regional differences are not as strong as we may believe also exist around generational differences, perhaps targeting policies? Sorry, my question.
But I think I get the question, Leslie, and it's a very good question.
Yeah, the person went on to say, sorry, discourse is often pinned on trying to appeal to tribes, be they regional or generational.
Yeah. We certainly control for generation. we looked at the possibility that that disagreement might be organized around generations rather than regions and values, and we found no evidence of that. I mean, by far, and if you look at the study, you will see, because we do present like the details of the analysis, and by far, it's the values that explain best the policy preferences of people, and therefore disagreement. It's not like wealth, it's not revenues, it's not again region, of course, and it's not generation either. Really, the main driving factor here is value differences, and it's independent from generations as well. That's an important thing to say.
Here's one focused on Quebec. Does your study suggest that the era of distinct society initiatives will fade into the sunset?
Well, that's a good question. Well, I mean, if distinct society means that there's the language of the majority is different in Quebec than it is in the rest of Canada, well, it's kind of obvious. Yeah, so the distinct society discourse could be supported on that ground. But if the discourse on distinct society is to say that Quebecers have values, the political values and political preferences that are widely different from those in the rest of Canada, well, our study does invalidate that thesis. But then again, there might be other ground to support that discourse of the distinct society in Quebec.
Here's someone who's looking for some practical advice in his or her daily job. In terms of the federal, provincial, territorial dynamic and the ability to influence intergovernmental relations, how would you suggest that provincial and territorial governments use value research to leverage their needs at federal negotiation tables?
Well, I guess it's a difficult question, and it's easy for me to give an answer that might not be all that practical for practitioners. But what I would say is that if you're across the table from a provincial colleague who disagrees, you should remind this colleague that there's an important segment of his own provincial population that have different views, and that have views perhaps that are closer to your own. And again, we often work or base our opinion or position, and I suppose it's the same for policymakers, on stereotypes. Conservatives in the prairies, environmentalists in BC, social democrats in Quebec and the Maritimes. Well, it's more complicated than that. And again, it would be important to remind those counterparts at the negotiation table that in their own province, they have a diverse population and some people who might actually support the initiative that you're putting forward and that your counterpart is disagreeing with. So that would be my answer. I don't know how practical that is.
Okay, someone wants you to talk about the role of the media, how the way they frame their stories, is that influenced by sets of values, or how regions are approached, how regions approach an issue, excuse me.
So if it's influenced by values, I think it's influenced by the values of journalists themselves. And that matters a great deal. And often journalists are not representatives, or the values of journalists are not representative of the values of the wider population. And so what you find among journalists is less diversity than what you have in the population, and therefore the way that they speak about some stories will activate some values within the populations, but not others that could be activated had journalists represented a wider range of values themselves. And I can give you an example. Actually, I published very recently an article in Policy Option with the IRPP on shale gas development in Quebec, basically showing that the framing of this issue in Quebec was extremely narrow. And we were talking about distinct society earlier. there is one thing that is distinct in Quebec. I mean, the language, French, kind of isolate to an extent, or to a larger extent than in the rest of Canada, its population in terms of the information that it receives. I mean, there are like a limited number of media from which we draw our information, like a narrower range of media than what's available in the English-speaking world, and sometimes it's so narrow that, you know, we have a handful of people informing us about policy issues, and we found that it was the case in the shale gas issue, and that these people seem to have like these people who were, these journalists who were informing us, this handful of journalists, have very cohesive social democratic or equalitarian values, and therefore it worked well to activate the equalitarian values found in the population, but it left all the traditionalists and all the legal rigorists basically indifferent to the issue.
Okay. Another question, how does the urban-rural values split factor into this, or does it?
Now I have to remember analysis that I've done a while ago. From what I remember, I think that we did not have this information in our data set. Like, that is, we did not have like the postal code of the respondents and things like that, but I'm not entirely sure. Like, I'd have to go back, but that's my sense, that we did not have the information to control for this, and it's certainly one limitation of our study. You know, if I had to do it all over again, I would certainly look at this rural-urban divide. But again, I don't think that we did, at least as far as I can remember.
Okay. Another participant is asking, in defining egalitarianism, is the emphasis more on the value of equality or the value of equity?
That's interesting. It's more, well, you've seen the questions in the on the slide where I showed the values. We have 3 questions basically that we use in this. One is about the redistribution of wealth by government. One is on equality between women and men, and the third one is, hold on just a second, is on providing a decent standard of living for everyone. So this is more like equity, whereas perhaps that the others are more about inequalities. So we tap in both, I would say, with the questions that we have.
Okay, here's a question that I'm going to read out so that I don't make any errors in summarizing. Is there any evidence on whether the value clusters you've identified have been or will be sustained over time? Policies, especially those formulated in legislation, are very hard to change, and so would be helpful for policymakers as well as advocates and opponents to know if they will continue to resonate with core values over time.
It's a very good question. Of course, I don't have any empirical evidence to provide a clear answer to that. We did like a single survey, so it's a snapshot that we got of the values in 2015. And of course, values evolve over time, but they evolve slowly. That's what we know from research in political science on values. So I guess that I'm quite sure that although this survey was done in 2015, the same values are still very important today. And I'm quite sure that they will still be very significant 5 years ago. Will they be very significant 20 years from now? I don't know. But for the immediate future, I would say that this is probably an accurate portrait. But again, I don't have the data to prove it.
Here's another question with a practical, even a strategic side to it. Value differences matter more than regional ones. Therefore, would that justify more federal intervention in areas of social policy if they correspond to the dominant ideology in Ottawa, particularly in areas where both orders of government may constitutionally intervene or justify use of the federal spending power?
That's a very interesting question. I would say that our survey does not really inform that question in the sense that we did not ask Canadians how they view federalism and the importance, for example, that they grant to the division, the constitutional division of powers. And if it were to be important for Canadians that the government respect those constitutional division of powers, and it's certainly something that should be important to legal rigorists, right? Like who believe that the law is extremely important. Well, if you don't want to upset these people, well, the national government should, to the extent possible, stay within its own jurisdictions. Now, this being said, if there were like circumstances that would justify somehow the federal government to intervene in some of these jurisdictions, and notably in the area of social welfare, well, maybe that they'd be able to count on the support of equalitarians all across the country. But perhaps again, not on the support of legal rigorists. So they'll have like legal rigorists to oppose this. But they might have social democrats from all over the country to support it. Although, again, we have not looked at the importance that social democrats and even legal rigorists accord to the distribution of jurisdictions between the provinces and the federal governments. It might very well be the case that equalitarians in Quebec believe that it's important for the federal government to stay within its jurisdictions. And if that is the case, well, then the federal government developing a social program won't find support in Quebec.
Here's another one with a little bit of a strategic edge to it. Can your research give us insight into the reluctance of some regions to participate in national programs such as security regulation? And can it provide insight into the difficulty of reducing and eliminating interprovincial trade barriers?
Well, to the first issue, one reason might simply be that the way the issue is framed in a region that is hesitant to participating in a national program is simply not activating the people that have values that would normally lead them to care about this issue. So again, issue framing is central here. So if the issue were framed, or if the federal government is looking for support across the country to a program, it should make some efforts to try to activate the values of those likely to be brought on board. And if there's pressure from the population for the government to participate in those programs, then it would. Now, interprovincial trade barriers, then again, I'm quite convinced that legal rigorists have a problem with this. And it's these people, if you want like national support for the elimination of these barriers, it's the people you should look into. It's the people whose values you should try to activate when framing the issue.
Okay, I'm going to put one last question to you. It's a fairly broad one, Eric. Should the federal government, be pursuing more aggressively national, in quotes, programs that pursue greater egalitarian values on the basis that they are similarly supported across the regions? For example, would this research affect how the federal government pursues the details of a national housing strategy or other federal municipal initiatives?
I think that governments should act in accordance to its own values and not in accordance to the particular interest of what it depicts as the values of a region rather than another region. And so basically, if you have a social democratic government in Ottawa that wants to develop a national housing program, for instance, I'd say that there's a way for this government to find support all across the country. If you have a conservative government in Ottawa that wants to cut funding to science, for instance, this government has a way to find support all across the country for this. Again, we live in a country where there's a plurality of value. Not a single region is homogeneous in terms of values, and therefore you can find support for any legitimate political project everywhere in Canada. So again, government should simply act in accordance with their own values, and they can be hopeful that they'll be able to find support across the country. It's possible. That's what our study shows, at least.
But I'm going to follow up myself with a question. That makes it all sound easy. So articulate a policy and show a little bit of leadership. You're going to have lots of hands up across the country. I don't think you mean that in the conclusion to your study.
Repeat that. That I mean what? That I mean that it's easy?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, you're right. One thing that I forgot to say is that if you're a government that wants to develop a national housing program, you can be hopeful that you'll find support all across the country. But you can also, or you should also know that it's likely that you'll have opposition also all across the country. I mean, of course, it's very likely that traditionalists, for instance, those who value the traditional organization of society, will be against this. And those people exist in every single region. So if you go forward with such a project, expect support all across the country, but also expect opposition across the country. All that we're saying is that federalism doesn't make the matter worse. I mean, we live in a pluralist country. Disagreement is a normal thing, and government have to, learn to make policy in this context. And that's the third implication that I mentioned of this study. They can learn a lot from each other because they will all face, or they will all have to work towards gathering support in similar ways, and have to learn how to face opposition in similar ways as well.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for your excellent answers to these questions. And thank you to the people who sent in the questions, some really, really good ones. We've done 3 of these webinars now in this research program. And I think this group wins the prize for the best set of questions. There were 280 people registered. We'll learn later how many people actually were online, but we think it was, judging from experience, quite a large group. Before I say goodbye, I just want to mention that the study by Professor Montpetit and his 2 colleagues is on our website. It's free of charge, like all our research studies and policy options articles. And the recording, the video of the webinar, will go on our website fairly shortly. So watch for that. It'll be mentioned in our monthly newsletter, or if you just take a look on the homepage, it'll be announced there. So thank you for your participation this afternoon and for your interest in IRPP. And thank you again to our colleagues at the Canadian Association for Business Economics for nudging us to do this and for being supportive as we organized it. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.